Many of you may recall the Royal Tournament at Earl's Court in London, the world's premier military tattoo and pageant that was held for over 100 years until 1999. And you may also recall the highlight of the event, the Royal Navy's Command Field Gun Competition. Two teams of 18 men hauling a 12-pound gun and limber weighing something like 1,200 pounds along a 225-yard course that included obstacles such as a 5-foot-high wall and a 28-foot chasm, all in under 3 minutes. It was not for the faint-hearted. Not only was it a gruelling race, but men were seriously injured too. Now, I have to admit that I have a soft spot for the field gun competition. My former father-in-law was in the Fleet Air Arm team twice in the 1960s. But where did the idea of this incredible feat of strength, stamina and teamwork come from? Well, it wasn't some made-up training or PR exercise. Its origins lay in a far-off African war, where sailors really did haul artillery pieces over rocky terrain, charge up steep slopes and cross raging rivers whilst under fire. A story of British ingenuity, grit and sacrifice that gave rise to the legendary race. The story of the iconic field gun race at the Royal Tournament has its roots in the Second Anglo-Boer War in South Africa, right at the end of Queen Victoria's long reign. The war, which broke out in October 1899 and lasted until 1902, saw the British Empire fighting the two Dutch-speaking republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State in South Africa. Whilst on paper the war was a foregone conclusion, it proved to be far from that. It was the first time since the Crimean War that the British Army would face a European enemy armed with the most up-to-date weaponry. That, along with the Boers' mobility and superior use of the terrain, would cost them dearly. Over 22,000 British troops died, and a further 75,000 returned home wounded or sick. Financially, it cost the British taxpayer a whopping £200 million. That's about £25 billion in today's money. And meanwhile, 6,000 Boer fighters died, along with 26,000 Boer civilians and up to 20,000 black Africans. Now, I've produced several stories about this conflict in the past, so please check them out if you want to get more details about exactly why the war erupted and what happened during it. When the war started in October 1899, it just so happened that the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Terrible, captained by Percy Scott, arrived at Simonstown Naval Base near Cape Town en route to China. Whilst there, she was joined by her sister ship, HMS Powerful, which was doing the reverse journey. The captain of HMS Powerful was the colourful 43-year-old Hedworth Lambton. A friend of the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, he had been present at the bombardment of Alexandria in 1882, had commanded the royal yacht Osborne, and had served as private naval secretary to two successive First Lords of the Admiralty. Arriving in Mauritius from Hong Kong before war had even been declared by the Boers, but aware that events were heading in that direction, he had embarked half a battalion of the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, without any official orders to do so, and had then deposited them in South Africa ready for the war. The presence of two Royal Navy cruisers in a war with two landlocked republics didn't particularly help matters. However, each ship did have a crew of nearly 900, and throughout the 19th century, naval brigades had been used to augment Queen Victoria's army in a variety of conflicts, ranging from the Crimean War, where they manned the guns during the siege of Sevastopol, to accompanying the Gordon Relief Expedition in Sudan, and participating in the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879. And they'd be needed again during this Boer War. Apart from the lack of men to counter the invading Boer commandos, the British also were at a significant disadvantage when it came to artillery. Whereas the Boers possessed long-range siege guns, long toms, capable of firing 94-pound shells to a distance of 1,000 yards, the British at this moment only had field guns, which could fire mere 15-pound shells about half that distance. The commander of the British garrison at the soon-to-be besieged town of Ladysmith, Lieutenant General Sir George White, appealed for heavier guns, but the British Army in South Africa didn't have any. However, the Royal Navy did. Percy Scott, captain of HMS Terrible, just happened to be one of the Royal Navy's foremost gunnery experts. He recognised that the guns on his cruiser could match the Boers' heavy artillery. The only problem was how to get those guns to the front line. He set about finding a solution. Working in a blacksmith shop at the naval dockyard at Simonstown, he drew the design of a gun carriage on the door. He then bought a pair of Cape wagon wheels and an axle tree, and then with his carpenters, shipwrights and blacksmiths, produced a prototype gun carriage for his 12-pounder guns in just 24 hours. 3 more 12-pounder guns were also mounted on improvised gun carriages, followed by 2 4.7-inch guns. Less than 2 weeks after he had started the project, Scott's 6 guns and their carriages left Simonstown on board HMS Powerful, steaming at full speed the 800 miles to Durban. Upon their arrival 4 days later, 283 officers and men from HMS Powerful under Captain Lambton immediately set out on the 189-mile journey towards the front with the mounted naval guns. It was a journey that would give rise to the legendary field gun competition. Manhandling the guns onto a train, they set out for the town of Ladysmith. Arriving on the 30th of October 1899, their trains were the last to get through before the siege began. They also ran straight into a major battle. On what became known as Mournful Monday, General White had launched a preemptive sortie against the approaching Boers, but it had ended in disaster, with the British losing 1,500 men killed, wounded or captured. As the British retreated in a near rout across the open plain back towards Ladysmith, the Naval Brigade's improvised 12-pounders went into action for the first time, while still on their railway carriages, covering the British withdrawal. Having silenced the Boer guns, the 12-pounders were then transported from the railway station using oxen and then manpower to their fighting positions around the perimeter of Ladysmith's defences. The guns remained in action, served by the Naval Brigade, for the 3.5-month siege. And whilst the actions of Lambton and his men would inspire the field gun competition, they were not the only ones. Further naval detachments would also manhandle their guns during this war, and the overlapping stories blended together to form the seed of the field gun competition. For instance, when a week later Percy Scott arrived at Durban aboard HMS Terrible with more converted guns, he wanted to show Army Commander General Buller that his mounted 4.7-inch guns could move without the need of slow oxen. He cabled one of his senior officers, Commander Arthur Limpus, and ordered him to lead a naval team pulling a gun 6.5 miles, firing a round, and then pull the gun all the way home. They completed the 13-mile round trip, hauling their 4.7-inch gun by drag ropes across the rough ground in the South African summer heat in 4.5 hours. Suitably impressed, General Buller ordered Scott to assemble a naval brigade from the crew of his ship, HMS Terrible, along with the men of HMS Powerful who hadn't gone with Lambton, and accompany his column heading to raise the siege of Ladysmith. They joined his relief column, which would eventually total 30,000 men. Whilst initially relying on teams of 16 oxen to pull each gun, the need for speed, the uneven terrain, and the fact that the animals were often spooked by Boer fire meant that Scott's men on more than one occasion resorted to hauling the guns themselves. Those sailors pulled their precious guns and the carriages that they were mounted on through thick mud, up and down steep slopes, and across fast-flowing streams. When one of the wheels broke, the men took the gun and carriage apart and carried it for 2 whole miles. After a series of reversals, in particular at Colenso and Speenkop, the siege of Ladysmith was finally lifted after 118 days on the 28th of February 1900. Of the men from the Naval Brigade defending Ladysmith, 1 officer and 5 men were killed in action. The officer was 30-year-old Lieutenant Frederick Greville Egerton. On the very first day the 4.7-inch guns were in action, 2nd of November, Lieutenant Egerton, the gunnery officer on HMS Powerful, had his leg shattered by a returning Boer shell. Told that both legs would need to be amputated, he quipped, "My cricketing days are over." Following the operation, he was perky enough to be sitting up, smiling and drinking champagne. It was a false dawn. He relapsed and died that evening. Posthumously promoted to commander, a primary school in Ladysmith, South Africa has borne his name since 1921. While 6 men from the Naval Brigade, including Egerton, were killed during the siege, a further 27 died from disease. HMS Powerful and HMS Terrible were not the only ships to supply sailors and Royal Marines for naval brigades during the Boer War. Nor were the naval brigades only operating in and around Ladysmith. Men from HMS Doris, HMS Monarch, HMS Tartar, HMS Forte and HMS Barossa were in the column that relieved the siege of Kimberley in the Cape. During that advance, 365 men from the Naval Brigade fought at the Battle of Graspan in late November 1899, where they suffered just over 100 casualties. HMS Powerful returned to Portsmouth on the 11th of April 1900 to a hero's welcome. Every ship in harbour was dressed with flags, crews swarmed along the yards cheering, and the Mayor of Portsmouth presented every crew member with an engraved silver pocket watch. The men paraded for Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle the next month, and their celebratory march through London was among the very first events ever recorded on film. The ship's captain, Hedworth Lambton, was introduced to Lady Muse, the widow of one of London's biggest brewers. Lady Muse had been so inspired by the stories of the Naval Brigade pulling their guns through the African terrain that she had ordered 6 12-pounder guns on travelling carriages sent to South Africa at her own expense. But more than that, she made Lambton sole heir of her fortune on condition that he changed his name to Muse. He did exactly that when she died in 1910. He went on to become an admiral and was Commander-in-Chief Portsmouth during the First World War. Meanwhile, Captain Percy Scott continued his journey to China in March 1900, where he would construct similar mobile naval gun carriages for use during the Boxer Rebellion. When he and the crew of HMS Terrible finally returned to Portsmouth in September 1902, they too received a rapturous reception. 700 officers and men were invited to a public dinner hosted by the Mayor. By now, the exploits of the Naval Brigade gun crews in South Africa had caught the public imagination. At the Royal Military Tournament of 1900, held at Islington's Agricultural Hall, sailors from HMS Powerful brought one of their 4.7-inch guns into the arena, pulled by 4 oxen. The oxen were unhitched, a round was fired, and then the sailors manhandled the gun out of the arena to enormous applause. Gun drill displays continued in subsequent years, with obstacles progressively added. A wall in 1903, a bridge in 1905. And then in 1907, Commander P.H. Hall Thompson, regarded as the father of the field gun competition, turned the display at the Royal Tournament into a proper competition between the Royal Navy commands at Portsmouth, Devonport and Chatham. The next year, the chasm was introduced, that 28-foot gap, to represent the rivers crossed in South Africa, and the competition and its legendary status just grew from there. The field gun competition ran at the Royal Tournament from 1907 to 1999, moving to Earl's Court in 1950, with the Fleet Air Arm joining the competition in 1947. The course became increasingly demanding. 2 teams of 18 men racing against each other whilst hauling a 12-pound gun and limber, combined weight just over 1,200 pounds, up and over a 5-foot wall, across a 28-foot chasm using wires and travellers, through a narrow wall 4 foot high, 2 foot wide, reassembling the gun, firing 3 rounds, before turning and completing the journey in reverse. A total of 225 yards, all the time being roared on by 12,000 spectators. Records kept tumbling, and the rivalry between Portsmouth, Devonport and the Fleet Air Arm became legendary. In 1998, the Ministry of Defence Strategic Defence Review decided that the Royal Tournament had run its course and was putting a strain on diminishing resources. It became a casualty of the peace dividend following the Cold War. The very last field gun competition at the final Royal Tournament took place in 1999. On that final night, all three Royal Navy teams defied an MOD ban and wore black armbands during the run. They reasoned that if they all did it, no penalties could be applied and no team disqualified. And they were right. On that very last night, Devonport set a new course record, 2 minutes 40.43 seconds. When they went to collect their trophies, it was the end of an era, and there was not a dry eye in the arena. But whilst the legend of the field gun competition at the Royal Tournament ended, the link all the way back to the Boer War was not broken entirely. In 1907, the year that the very first competition was held at the Royal Tournament, a Portsmouth-based brewer, Sir John Brickwood, donated a magnificent silver trophy to be competed for by gun crews from just the Portsmouth area. The big difference with this competition was that it was over a flat course with no obstacles. The Brickwood Trophy is still competed for annually at HMS Collingwood, although teams from outside the Portsmouth area, and indeed from the other armed services, can now take part. That trophy, with its silver sailors firing their field gun, remains a link to the men of the Naval Brigade, fighting in a faraway war 125 years ago. I bet many of you, rather like me, wish that the Royal Tournament and the field gun competition still took place. But hopefully this story is, in a small way, a nod to all the men who participated in it over the years, including Brian Pinnington. And if you enjoy my channel and want to support my work, then there are links as to how you can do so in the description below. Because coming soon, we have the real wartime story of Uncle Albert from Only Fools and Horses. But until then, thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.